Christmas is supposed to be a time of joy, warmth, and togetherness. But for me, Christmas 2024 started with a patched-up sock and a pair of gloves I could barely afford for my little sister. Our home was cold, not just from the winter chill, but from the silence that had lingered for years. I thought it was going to be just another holiday we'd struggle to get through. Stay with me, because this is the Christmas I'll never forget. Christmas 2024. The small town of Hudson, nestled deep in a valley in upstate New York, sparkled under the glow of holiday lights. Snow fell gently, blanketing rooftops and streets, while the church bells chimed every hour, filling the air with a festive melody. But in a tiny wooden house at the end of the street, where my sister Laura and I lived with our foster father, the holiday cheer felt like a distant world. Laura, my 8-year-old sister, sat on the worn-out rug, carefully trying on the pair of gloves I had worked hard to buy for her. It was the only gift I could afford this year after saving every penny from my part-time job at the bakery near school. I sat by the window, mending my old socks, the same pair my foster mom had given me on Christmas when I was 10. Though they were tattered, they were one of the few pieces of her I still had left. Life hadn't been easy since my foster mom passed away while giving birth to Laura. Her death changed everything. My foster dad, who once seemed full of love and warmth, became a shadow of himself, burying his pain in bottles of whiskey. The warmth in our house turned cold, and Laura became the target of his frustrations. I still remember the day Laura accidentally spilled a glass of water. He yelled so loudly, she ran to her room in tears. Since then, I vowed to protect her, even if it meant taking on burdens number 18-year-old should have to bear. Hudson wasn't always this gloomy for me. I used to love Christmas in this town. I remember when my foster mom would bake gingerbread cookies while I helped decorate our tiny Christmas tree with handmade ornaments. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the house felt alive with laughter and love. But all of that faded the day she left us. I glanced outside the frosted window. Across the street, the McCarthy family's house was glowing with strings of lights. Through their large living room window, I could see their children running around the tree, their laughter echoing faintly through the night. It wasn't jealousy I felt, it was a deep ache. Watching them reminded me of what Laura was missing, a childhood filled with warmth and love. Despite it all, Laura was a strong little girl. She rarely complained, even when she had every reason to. But there were moments when her questions left me at a loss for words. "Mia, why doesn't Dad love me?" she asked one night, her big brown eyes staring at me, searching for answers. I hugged her tightly, hoping she wouldn't notice the tears welling up in my own eyes. Tonight, while the rest of Hudson gathered in the town square for the annual Light Festival, I chose to stay home with Laura. I didn't don a coat warm enough for the freezing weather, and Laura's shoes weren't made for trudging through thick snow. Instead, we shared a quiet evening together, splitting the last of our bread from lunch. "What's your Christmas wish this year, Laura?" I asked, hoping to lighten her mood. She thought for a moment before whispering, "I just want Dad to smile at me, even just once." Her words felt like a dagger to my heart. Unlike other kids who wished for dolls or candy, Laura's wish was heartbreakingly simple and impossibly difficult: the love of the one person left in our family. Outside, the church bells rang, marking the hour. Midnight was near. I tucked Laura into her blanket, pulling it tighter around her small frame. As she drifted off to sleep, I stared at her peaceful face, wondering how I could make this Christmas different, how I could give her even a sliver of happiness. But deep down, I didn't know where to start. The story of how I came to live in this house, with Laura and our foster father, is one that I rarely speak of. It's not that I'm ashamed, but because every detail feels like reopening an old wound. I was only 7 when my biological parents died in a car accident. I don't remember much from before that, just fragments of happy moments. A picnic in a park, my dad teaching me to ride a bike, my mom baking cookies and letting me lick the spoon. After the accident, those memories felt like a cruel reminder of everything I had lost. I was sent to a state-run orphanage not long after. The orphanage was adequate. There was food, there was a roof over my head, but there was no love. Nights were the hardest. I'd curl up in bed, clutching a tattered photo of my parents, and pray that someone would come and take me home. When I was 9, my prayers were seemingly answered. A kind-looking couple, Mr. and Mrs. Hargrave, visited the orphanage and chose me. I remember the joy I felt that day, the thought of having a family again. Mrs. Hargrave had this gentle smile, and she knelt down to my level, brushing a strand of hair from my face as she said, "Welcome home, Mia." For a while, life was good. The Hargraves weren't wealthy, but they made sure I had everything I needed. Mrs. Hargrave treated me like her own, teaching me to bake cookies, just like my mom used to. And Mr. Hargrave, though quieter, always made time to read me bedtime stories. I thought I had found my forever family. But then Laura was born. Mrs. Hargrave had complications during the pregnancy, and when the time came, the doctors couldn't save her. She passed away the same day Laura came into this world. I was 11 at the time, old enough to understand what death meant, but too young to grasp the full impact it would have on our lives. Mr. Hargrave was never the same after that. He buried his grief in bottles of whiskey, isolating himself from everyone, including Laura and me. For a while, he tried to manage, but the burden of raising 2 kids alone, combined with his overwhelming sorrow, broke him. He became distant and harsh. His anger often boiled over into yelling, and Laura, being so young and defenseless, bore the brunt of it. If she spilled something or forgot to clean up, he'd lash out with words that cut deeper than any punishment. There were nights when I thought he'd send me back to the orphanage. I overheard him once, muttering to himself in a drunken haze, "Why did I take her in? She's not even mine." The next morning, I begged him to let me stay. I promised to take care of Laura, to do all the chores, anything to keep us together. Reluctantly, he agreed. From that day on, I became more than just a sister to Laura. I became her protector, her caretaker, and, in some ways, her stand-in parent. But it wasn't easy. Balancing school, part-time jobs, and taking care of Laura left little time for myself. There were days when I wanted to scream, to cry, to run away. But every time I looked at Laura's face, her innocent eyes, her trusting smile, I reminded myself why I stayed. Laura was the only light in our dark little world. She didn't remember Mrs. Hargrave, but I made sure she knew about her. I'd tell her stories about how kind and loving her mom was, how she used to sing lullabies while baking cookies, or how she always kissed our foreheads before bed. "Do you think Mom watches us from heaven?" Laura asked me once, her small voice breaking the silence of the night. "I'm sure she does," I replied, even though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. "She's probably smiling right now, proud of how strong you are." Laura clung to those stories, to the idea of a mother who loved her unconditionally, even if she never got to meet her. As for Mr. Hargrave, I sometimes wondered if he even remembered what it felt like to love. His moments of sobriety were few and far between, and when they came, they were awkward and fleeting. But even then, I could see glimpses of the man he used to be, a man who had once tried to give me a second chance at a family. Today, as the clock struck midnight, I was about to put Laura to bed when a knock echoed through the stillness of our small home. At first, I froze, unsure of who would visit us at this hour, especially on Christmas Eve. The streets of Hudson were deserted by now, the snow piling higher against our front steps. Curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously opened the door. Standing there was a man dressed in a Santa suit, complete with a red hat and a fluffy white beard. He wasn't like the jolly Santas I had seen in movies or outside department stores. This one had an air of solemnity, his eyes kind but somehow heavy with something I couldn't quite place. In his gloved hands, he held a small box wrapped in plain red paper, tied with a gold ribbon. He didn't say a word, which unsettled me even more. Instead, he handed me a folded piece of paper. I hesitated but took it, my fingers trembling slightly in the cold. Written in simple, neat handwriting were the words, "What is your Christmas wish?" I turned to Laura, who had crept up behind me, clutching my hand tightly. Her wide, curious eyes darted between me and the man in the Santa suit. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, Laura, with the innocence only a child could possess, took a step forward. Her voice quivered as she whispered, "I want my mom." The words hung in the icy air like a fragile snowflake, delicate yet piercing. My chest tightened, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. Laura's big brown eyes brimmed with tears, her small hands gripping the edge of her sweater. The man didn't respond. He stood there, motionless, as if absorbing the weight of her wish. His silence wasn't cold or dismissive, it was understanding, even compassionate. But there was also an unspoken truth in it. This was a wish that couldn't be granted. I knelt beside Laura, pulling her close, and tried to soothe her as best I could. "Sweetheart," I said softly, "Mom is always with us, in here." I placed my hand over her heart, hoping the gesture would bring her comfort, though it felt like a hollow reassurance even to me. But something about the man's presence felt different. His silence spoke volumes, and for a moment, it felt as though he was waiting for something more. And then, without fully understanding why, I stood up and called out to him just as he turned to leave. "Wait." My voice cracked, the words spilling out of me before I could stop them. "If you can't bring her back," I said, my voice trembling, "then, can you make Laura feel loved? Can you make my dad love her as much as he loved my mom? Love her enough for both of them?" The man stopped in his tracks. For a second, I thought he wouldn't respond. But then he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his profile. He raised a gloved hand in a subtle gesture, a nod, an acknowledgement. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he disappeared into the falling snow, his figure blending into the shadows of the night. I stood there for a long moment, staring after him. The folded paper was still in my hand, and the small red box remained untouched by my side. It wasn't until Laura tugged on my sleeve that I snapped out of my daze. "Mia, what did you ask for?" she whispered. I looked down at her, her face still streaked with the tears she had shed for a mother she barely remembered. "I asked for something we've needed for a long time," I said, pulling her close. "I asked for love." I close my eyes, hoping that when I wake up tomorrow, there will be a new heater and a pair of leather boots waiting for me.